everyone, Jimmy from Lollar Pickups here. If you're like me, you've been trapped in your house for weeks on end and you're starting to get desperate for anything to fill the chasm of free time that you have on your hands. I know for me, my days had started blurring together and I legitimately couldn't tell you what day it was more often than not right now, but I also started feeling discouraged just because of the whole situation. Instead of focusing on the negative, I decided I wanted to give myself a project, something to keep my mind and hands occupied. So I decided to take a guitar that I had laying around and wasn't using because, quite frankly, it wasn't playable, and give it a new lease on life. The guitar was an early 70s Teisco, based loosely on the Fender Mustang design with the short-scaled, dual single-coil pickups and what have you. But this thing was in horrible condition when I got it. The original pickups were unusably microphonic, the pots were all rusted and rotted out, the pickguard was warped, the bridge was horrible, the neck was set at a weird angle, the tuners were just almost unusable. I traded a couple of guitar pedals for it, so I wasn't too concerned with it. It was always just going to be a project that I'd do later, but I guess now is later. So I thought, why not? Just give it a total overhaul. So let's take a look at what I did. So here's the guitar. As you can see, I cut a new pickguard for it, put in a new selector switch, a pair of Lollar Jaguar pickups, Emerson Custom pots and caps, new output jack, Wilkinson roller bridge, and I also replaced the tuners. All in all, I put more work into the guitar and more parts than the guitar itself is actually worth. But now I've got a guitar that plays well and sounds great, something that will actually get used instead of just hung on a wall. Now the important thing here is, I made it a point to not use any tools that weren't readily available to the average person. I didn't even have a router. I used a cutting blade on my Dremel. I also don't have any formal education when it comes to guitar work, so nothing that I do in this video will be above or beyond what the average person could do. I hope you enjoy the video, but more, I hope this video encourages you to do the same. Dig in, get your hands dirty, take a guitar that you've had laying around the house for a few years, not being used, and give it a new lease on life. Turn it into the guitar that you'd always hoped it would be. At this point, I hadn't actually decided that I wanted to make this video, so I wasn't recording my progress. All I'd done up until now was lay the original pickguard down on some single-ply black pickguard material, and trace the outline with an X-Acto knife to get the silhouette. Then, using a cutting blade and my Dremel tool, I simply whittled away the excess material until I was at about a 32nd of an inch outside the outline that I had traced. The remaining material was removed using my bench grinder, and finally, sandpaper. As you can see from this close-up shot of the cutting blade, the design's somewhere between a router bit and a drill bit. This thing made fast work of the pickguard material, so be careful not to let it get away from you, or you could ruin the pickguard in a fraction of a second. What I really love about these cutting blades is that you can use them for very broad, coarse cuts, like cutting right down the center of your material, or for more detailed stuff, like removing tiny fraction of an inch bits off the edge. It's all in how you handle it. You can just as easily rip right through, or you can go a little slower and use a little bit less pressure to have better control. I also really like this little router collar attachment for my Dremel tool, because it helps control the angle of the cutting blade, and it has a good sized window to allow you to clearly see the cutting area. Now, if I was really going to get picky about it, I wouldn't have even traced the original pickguard to begin with, as it has its own flaws. One, for example, it doesn't actually follow the lines of the guitar very well, with some places having big gaps and others sitting snug to the parts and curves of the guitar. But designing my own pickguard from the ground up would have taken quite a bit longer, and I was really hoping to keep this project down to a single day time frame. Now that we're moving on to the bench grinder, you can see how I use both the face and side surfaces of the wheel to grind off different angles and curves. This might not be as effective with other stock, but it's no trouble at all with this pickguard material. It's also important to use appropriate variation in pressure. At times I use just enough force to hold the material in place, allowing the wheel to just barely touch the pickguard. This is a great old woodworker's trick that I learned from my grandpa when I was a kid. Wrapping sandpaper around a dowel makes it much easier to sand curved or concave surfaces. It's also an easier way to control the amount of pressure being applied, to ensure that you don't gut out sections or accidentally round off the top and bottom edges of the material you're sanding. For this part, I used masking tape through the pickup routes of the original pickguard to hold it in place as I marked the mounting screw holes with my X-Acto blade. I then used a center punch to ensure that the number 8 countersinking bit that I was going to use to drill and countersink the mounting screw holes in the new material didn't walk when I started drilling. My cheap Harbor Freight drill press is great for the price and it does everything I need it to do, but it's definitely not the most precise tool, so there's quite a bit of fallout at the tip of the bit. The center punch helps lock the bit right where I want to drill. I also used a little bit of cardboard under the pickguard to give it a little extra support to reduce the flex in the material. And there you have it. Nice, clean, countersunken screw holes. Since I'm going totally custom with this, I pretty much just need to get the general placement of the new pickups. The body is routed with much more space than needed for the pickups that I'll be installing, so I have lots of room to work with. The main thing to focus on here is ensuring that the new pickups are centered under the strings. Since the original ones were, I just need to center my new routes relative to the old ones. I tried using a white chalk pencil, which worked okay, but I found it much easier to use masking tape and a pen to trace the outlines of the original holes, then lay the new pickups on there and trace them as well. While this didn't necessarily give me the most accurate results, the guitar was obviously not built with any sort of perfectionist agenda to begin with, so it's kind of appropriate. I should also mention here, I chose to use the backside of the pickguard material as the front, due to the fact that it's not quite as shiny as the side intended to be the top. I felt the contrast between an obviously brand new shiny pickguard against the worn aesthetic of the rest of the guitar would seem a little off. The less polished look of the backside just seems more fitting. So now I've come to the point of no return. This is the part I've always been the most intimidated by. Cutting big chunks out of the middle of my otherwise perfectly good pickguard. Except, without those holes cut, it's more functional as a drink coaster than a pickguard. I used my drill press to do the coarse removal, then cleaned the rest up with a cutting blade and Dremel. This time I had to be more careful, as I couldn't just leave a 32nd of an inch on there and then take it to the bench grinder. So I got as close to the line as possible, and maybe even a little too close a time or two. But again, there are parts of this guitar that left the factory looking worse than anything I've done to it, so I wasn't too concerned. After I cut most of the material out, I went back with a dowel and sandpaper to clean it up a bit more. I like to do periodic checks for fitment and clearance, because sometimes it can be easy to go a little too far and ruin all of your progress. It's always better to check more than needed than to cut more than needed. Everything looks well enough, so on to sanding those edges. If you think this part gets a little monotonous to watch, imagine being the one actually doing it. I'm sure you can imagine, but to give you a little reference, this footage has been edited down and then sped up 800% to spare you a real-time replay. The fact is though, sanding is just one of those steps you cannot shortcut if you want to achieve a good fit and finish. For all the quirks of these old guitars, I didn't want people to take one look at it and just know that I made the pickguard in my garage, so I took the time to get a nice clean edge. I wanted to soften the top edge a little, similar to the results you'd get with a quarter round router bit, so I sanded the side and top edges to the shape that looked and felt good. I worked my way from medium to a really fine grit paper, stopping only when I found that I felt a very smooth edge when running my fingers across it. Because I was upgrading the control components from the cheap metric pots that the factory used to bigger standard ones from Emerson Custom, I needed to bore out the control plate a little bit for the larger parts. I used a clamp as an extra set of hands to secure the piece, and a step bit to drill it out to the correct size for the new parts. After I got the holes cut to the right size, I flipped the piece over and cleaned up the burrs on the back side as well. And again, always check fitment. Looks good. Now on to the guts of this thing. When doing installs, I like to get my workspace set up and do as much of the prep work as possible before I start doing any actual soldering. In this case, I laid out all the parts and tools that I'd be using and pre-assembled the pots and output jack on the control plate. A big plus of doing this sort of thing is that while I'm soldering, I won't be as likely to need to stop what I'm doing to free up my hands. I can simply hold the soldering iron in one hand and grab whatever it is I need with the other. As you can see here, I'm heating up the leg of the switch, not the solder. This is to ensure a nice, clean, and strong solder joint. If your solder pools don't dry to a smooth, shiny silver finish, then you're probably not using the right technique. It might work just fine, but cold solder joints have a greater chance of failure. There are tons of great tutorials on soldering out there, so I won't get too into all of that right now, but it's important that you know a few basics before you start. First, as mentioned, you don't want to heat up the solder and hope to get the melted solder into the component. You want to heat up the component until it's hot enough to melt the solder. This will cause the solder to draw into the heated part for better joints. Of course, you do need to be careful not to overheat some components as well, so you may need to use a heat sink from time to time. And second, you want to be sure that you clean off the tip of your iron before and after every solder joint. This will help keep the solder pools clean and strong, as well as prevent the tip of your iron from overheating and becoming pitted and burnt prematurely. When I grab the iron, I always try to remember to wipe off the tip on a damp sponge. Then I'll pre-tin it with a small amount of fresh solder. And before putting it away, I like to tap the iron to knock off any leftover excess solder, and then wipe it off again on the sponge before putting it in the holder. I've always loved how clean Emerson Custom pre-wired kits are. They're far more capable than I am with a soldering iron, but I've definitely taken some inspiration from their work. I like how they use solder bridges for the grounding from one pot to the next, so I tried my hand at it here with reasonably good results. If you find yourself burning through tons of solder trying to do this like I have in the past, just know that there's no real downside to just using wire to connect the ground lines on all the pots. It just looks cooler with a solder bridge. In this particular case, I had limited space in the control route, so I had to keep everything as tight and neat as possible, otherwise I might not have been so meticulous. You may notice that, during the process, I continually test the fit and functionality as I go. If something isn't working as it should, I'd rather know right away so I have less backtracking to do to troubleshoot the issue. It's better to catch these things sooner than later after I think I'm all done and have everything reassembled, only to have to tear it back apart and go through step by step to chase down the culprit. You'll see this over and over in various forms throughout this video. Unfortunately in this case, doing so meant that I totally forgot to film the real final assembly, showing the cleanly run lead wires all neatly twisted and organized. You'll just have to take my word for it and imagine how glorious it looks. When I test the functionality of the electronics, I like to run every possible scenario. By lightly tapping the pole pieces with a steel tool, such as an Allen wrench or a small screwdriver, I'm able to make sure that the correct pickups are switched off and on, respectively, in all selector switch positions. I also listen for hum cancellation when the pickups are combined, confirm that the bridge ground is functioning, and I check to make sure that the volume and tone controls are doing what they should. If everything isn't working as intended, it's much easier to find and fix the problem before you get the guitar reassembled and restrung. I'll also note the reason that I've removed the tailpiece was just to clean it up a little bit. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been necessary to remove it. Since I'm installing single coils and this particular body doesn't have any shielding paint in the cavity, I decided to add some foil tape to the pickguard and body to try to help shield against some of the unwanted noise. The way to ensure that the shielding is as effective as possible is to make sure that there's complete coverage and good continuity. You can see how I extended a small portion from the body route up to the top of the guitar, and I also add some tabs that extend even further, such as the part of this video where I detailed a piece of foil tape under the area where the control plate mounting screw passes into the body. This will ensure that the foil has continuity to the plate, which in turn has continuity to the pots, which are grounded. So this means any interference picked up by the shielding will be shunted to ground through the pots. You do need to be careful though, not to let any of your hot signal touch the foil tape, or it too will short to ground and you'll have no signal coming from the guitar. You can also see that I wrap masking tape around my finger or use a piece of paper when smoothing out the foil tape. I do this because I found out the hard way that this stuff can slice you like a razor blade if you run your finger down the edge or on a seam. The tape and paper act as a barrier of protection against this, and as an added bonus, it has much less friction against the tape when working out the wrinkles, so it moves much faster and smoother. This portion is just to detail how I secured the bridge ground wire using the bridge mounting screw. When I installed the new bridge, I simply tucked the bridge ground wire down into the bushing hole in the body before the bushing was inserted, which offers the same results. I've chosen not to include the installation of the tuning machines or bridge in this video. The tuners seem too self-explanatory, and the reason I excluded the bridge install was because I'd never done it before, and to be honest, I didn't want to document it if I would have messed anything up. Also, I don't want to assume any sort of liability for anyone potentially messing up their own instrument based on my tutorial. I found some videos online that showed me how to do it, and I'm sure with a little searching, you can find the same ones. If you do decide to do any sort of irreversible modifications to your instrument, you'll have to do so on your own. That being said, it's really not that difficult, so I encourage anyone with even a moderate skill set with this sort of thing to give it a shot. Just take your time, and as the saying goes, measure twice, cut once. Or drill once. So now that I've got it all wrapped up, I can honestly say that this was time well spent. This guitar is an absolute blast. It's a fun, quirky, and easy-to-play instrument that sounds even better than it looks. I have a pretty good collection of instruments that aren't technically worth the value of how much time and materials were invested into them, but like this guitar, they've all become instruments that are much more enjoyable to play and sound way better now than they did before I modified them. And speaking of how good this thing looks and sounds, let's check it out.